term infancy usually refers to the first 18 months of life. By this time, the child is able to move with confidence and coordination and has begun to use and understand language in a symbolic and productive way. Surprisingly, the newborn infant is remarkably capable from the moment he takes his first breath. He can hear and smell and is sensitive to pain, touch, and changes in position. He is ready to experience most of the basic sensations of his species from the moment he is born. Moreover, many of his responses are remarkably well developed. For example, his eyes follow a black line on a white background and track it effectively on the very first day of his life. He orients and shows signs of searching for an unexpected sound. If placed in a dark room, he would probably open his eyes while searching. Psychologists have devised other ways of telling whether a baby has heard or is listening to a sound. For example, the infant's heart rate often slows down when he orients to a sound that does not startle him or to a picture that is interesting. The heart rate has been useful in indicating different states of wakefulness, for the infant seems to react differently to touch when he is awake than when he is asleep. Specifically, his heart rate increases if his cheek is touched when he is sleeping, but decreases if touched when awake. Here, another basic response is shown as the baby searches for a nipple in order to feed himself, displaying a reflex called rooting. He is able to grasp an object with some strength when it is placed in his palm. And if his foot is placed along the edge of a table, he will move his leg up as if he were trying to steady himself, a response called the placing reflex. He is able to taste sweet, salty, and bitter substances and reacts to unpleasant olfactory stimuli such as acetic acid with a grimace. Finally, the child shows a dramatic reaction when the position of his head is changed through dropping. This response is called the Moro reflex and will disappear when the child is about 4 months of age. Professor Eleanor Gibson suggested that the young child may be capable of perceiving depth from the moment he is born, as evidenced by an avoidance of the deep side on this apparatus called a visual cliff. Although the child being tested could have learned to appreciate depth, animals that can walk at birth show avoidance of the deep side from the earliest hours after birth. This fact suggests that were the human infant able to locomote at birth, he too would show similar depth perception. The infant also shows a gradual mastery of more complex motor movements. One interesting development has been called visually directed reaching. An attractive object is placed in the field of vision of a 2-month-old. He will stare at it, but will make no attempt to grab it. At 4 months, he will raise his hand in the vicinity of the object, alternating his glance between his hand and the object, until he may possibly touch it. By 5½ months, the infant reaches and contacts the object efficiently. His aim perfected, he has passed another developmental milestone. Other complex motor coordinations involve being able to hold a cup correctly. There are definite stages in the development of this skill, and by the time a child is a little over a year of age, he is able to hold a cup in a coordinated and efficient manner. The infant only gradually acquires the ability to solve problems. Note that he doesn't know what to do when a simple barrier prevents him from obtaining an attractive toy. A half-year from now, he will know exactly what to do and will either knock down the barrier or go around it. Finally, the infant passes through the important maturational sequence from crawling to creeping to standing to walking. In general, the average for crawling tends to be about 35 weeks, while creeping on hands and feet usually occurs around 49 weeks, just before the first year is over. The ability to walk alone with no support is achieved somewhere after the first birthday. Maturation of his neural and muscular systems, rather than the amount of teaching a child gets or his place of residence, determines when he will sit, stand, or walk. Just as the infant's motor development is partially controlled by changes in his nervous system, so too are some of his perceptual and cognitive processes influenced by maturation. The events the child will look at or listen to with maximal intensity are dependent upon biological development. Since the child is most likely to learn something from his environment when he is attending to it, it is important to determine the principles that control his attentiveness. Recent research suggests that during the first 30 days of life, the young infant is most likely to look at events that possess a great deal of change. In the visual mode, these include stimuli that move rather than those that are stationary, and stimuli that have a lot of black and white contrast rather than those of a homogeneous color. Sustained attention to a visual stimulus like a bullseye is called fixation time. However, by the time the child is 2 to 3 months of age, a second factor influences his attention, and this factor is a function of experience. He is more likely to show long fixations to stimuli that are a little different from what he knows or expects. We call these stimuli discrepant. The infant is more likely to look at a black and white outline of a face than a meaningless design with a large amount of black and white contour, for the outline of the face is a little discrepant from his understanding of a human face. The child's attention to events seems to be a curvilinear function of degree of familiarity. That is, stimuli which are either very familiar or completely novel elicit less sustained attention than events that are just a little different from his past experience, stimuli that are moderately discrepant. The child not only looks longer at the discrepant stimuli, he is also more excited by them. If a child is shown a 2-inch wooden cube for 8 repeated trials and comes to expect this display, he becomes excited and babbles if he is shown a smaller cube because it is a moderate discrepancy from what he knows. By contrast, he does not become excited when he sees a novel stimulus like the yellow plastic rippled form, because he perceives no relation between the yellow form and the large cube. There is no puzzle to be understood, and he is not emotionally aroused. Similarly, when an infant first sees this car rolling down the incline, he is quiet and very attentive because he is trying to understand it. As the event becomes understandable, he becomes excited and begins to laugh and vocalize. Nature might have wired the child so that only these 2 factors, change and discrepancy, were needed to understand the events that the child devotes attention to. However, we are forced to consider a 3rd factor because of the way the infant behaves when we show masks of human faces. The 4-month-old devotes considerable attention to all masks, especially those that have eyes. As the child approaches 8 months, he devotes less attention to them because they are less discrepant from his understanding of the face. If discrepancy were the only factor, he should look even less as he gets older. However, infants tested in the United States, Central America, and Africa all show an increase in attention to the masks toward the end of the 1st year. Beginning at 1 year of age, the child is trying to interpret what he sees, trying to transform the discrepant masks into his understanding of a face. Thus we introduce the 3rd factor, the activation of hypotheses, in order to understand discrepant experience. The relationship between the age of the child and the amount of attention shown to the masks is in the shape of a U, with the low point occurring between 8 and 12 months of age. It is probably more than coincidence that just about the time when the infant begins to increase his attention to masks, he also begins to understand language and to speak his first words.
Where's Daddy? Where's Daddy?
It is also the time when the child comes to believe that objects continue to exist even though they are out of sight. This cognitive attainment is called object permanence by Jean Piaget. At first, the child has no notion of objects which he can no longer see. Out of sight means it does not exist. Later on, he acts as though objects are part of their original location and searches for an object where he found it last, even when he has seen that object moved elsewhere. Only at 18 months does he arrive at the hypothesis that an object continues to exist regardless of its displacement in space or time. Note the child's surprise when the object is not where it should be. The achievement of the object concept, or the permanence of objects, is one of the highlights of the first stage of development. Since the child is always trying to understand discrepant experience, it is helpful to know when he is successful. Children often tell us when they achieve understanding by smiling. Unfortunately, if the child does not smile, we cannot infer that he is not comprehending the event. When the 4-month-old child smiles to the human face, he tells us that he recognizes that that new human resembles his idea of a human face. He gets the point. However, it is important to realize that the infant's smile has other meanings in addition to understanding. Near the end of the first year, he will smile as a way of communicating to another person. Or as a way to express general excitement. So far, our description of the infant has portrayed him as a rather isolated learner, not very involved with the people around him. However, for a part of his day, he is interacting with adults who care for and play with him. This interaction leads him to develop an attachment to people. By attachment, we mean the tendency to orient to and approach certain people when the infant is in a state of distress or anxiety. The concept of attachment is new in our theorizing about the child, but it is important. The need for this concept was demonstrated by Professor Harry Harlow. In his experiments, monkey infants were fed from a bottle attached to the chest of a plain wire mesh mother, while others were fed by a mesh mother covered with terry cloth. When the monkeys were given a choice of going to either one, they characteristically chose the terry cloth mother and spent more time clinging to her than to the plain wire mesh. They were also more likely to choose the terry cloth mother when they were afraid. Similar processes may be occurring in the human infant. Each animal species is born with a set of behaviors that it can emit at birth or very soon afterwards, and the young infant directs these responses to the most appropriate person or target in the environment. In the human infant, these natural reactions are smiling, babbling, sucking, manipulating, and holding. Normally, they are directed at the adult who cares for the child, most often the mother. As a result, the baby gradually becomes attached to this person and will feel more secure with the object of attachment than with a stranger. One reason for a greater sense of security with a familiar figure is related to the fact that an infant develops a very well-articulated idea for the caretaker's face, form, and voice. The stranger is therefore a discrepant stimulus that alerts the infant. If he cannot understand or assimilate this discrepant event, he will show fear. There are two important sources of fear in the first year of life: the presence of strangers and physical separation from the mother. In stranger fear, an unfamiliar person can make the child cry. This usually occurs around 6 to 8 months of age. It is important to note that the child is less likely to cry to a stranger when he is in physical contact or close to his mother. A second fear that occurs a few months later is called separation anxiety. Now the child cries when his mother leaves him in a strange surrounding, when no familiar adult is present, and when there is nothing he can do to cope with the fear. We believe the child cries because his notion of his mother includes the normal location where she is found. If she leaves him in a strange place, and the child cannot interpret this event, he becomes frightened. However, if the child can do something when he is faced with discrepancy of his mother leaving, then he may not become seriously afraid and may not cry. For example, one of the things a child can do faced with this discrepant event is to play with a toy. If mobile, the child can get up and follow her. This simple phenomenon of separation fear contains all the important elements of anxiety and defense seen in adolescents and adults. For it is generally true for all of us that when confronted with an unusual event which we cannot interpret or deal with in some way, we are likely to become afraid. Up to now, we have been talking as if all infants reacted in the same way, as if they all matured at the same rate and reacted with either fear or happiness to the same situations. This is not true, for there are dramatic differences among infants on many psychological dimensions, which can be seen from the very first day. Some infants are irritable and cry a lot. Others are placid, cry very little. Some are active and squirmy. Others are motorically quiet. Some actively attack an obstacle. Others are passive. The differences in vigor or irritability may be short-lived and have little predictive influence on later preschool or adolescent personality and behavior. However, it is equally possible that these temperamental differences may be important, for one can imagine the differential impact of some of these differences on a young mother. An irritable infant, for example, is more likely to vex, puzzle, or irritate a parent and perhaps create a resentful attitude. A quiet baby is less likely to elicit this irritation in the mother. Thus, we can imagine that even among mothers with the same personalities and education, if they are given babies of different temperament, they are likely to behave differently with them and so produce different kinds of children. Another important difference among babies is the rapidity with which they become bored with an event or a toy. This tendency can be seen easily in the child's play around 8 months of age. Some infants invest long periods of time in a particular object, maybe 40 or 50 seconds. Others play with it for only 5 or 6 seconds. It is believed that these slower-tempoed infants, who invest long periods of time with a toy, are more likely to become reflective, pensive, or inhibited, as opposed to children who show a fast tempo of play. In summary, the infant is born with considerable sensomotor maturity, which develops further during the first 18 months. In a similar fashion, determinants of attention change in a lawful way and in part reflect the child's maturation level. The infant becomes attached to those adults who care for him, and as part of this attachment, he develops a schema for those individuals. When he encounters discrepancies from these people, he is likely to become afraid, especially if he cannot cope with these discrepant events. It is these processes that account for stranger and separation anxiety, a response seen worldwide. Finally, each infant's unique temperamental disposition leads him to experience unique reactions from people in his environment, and in this complex interaction, his personality is formed.